So hello and welcome to this NPTEL course entitled Introduction to Culture Studies. We were looking at Catherine Belsey's book, Critical Practice. This will be the concluding lecture on this book. So the section we will study at the moment, we'll begin with the section that is entitled The Subject and the Text. So we just saw in the last lecture how Belsey talks about, she obviously draws on Althusser and talks about ideology and the covert and overt mechanisms of ideology and how ideology oftentimes operates through omissions and gaps. So omissions and gaps in ideological narratives become equally important, perhaps sometimes more important than what is stated and articulated. So what is absent and what is sort of held back, what is concealed, becomes more important than what is revealed and what is represented. So ideology becomes a very complex mechanism which operates through certain institutions which are defined as ideological state apparatus, which include education systems, educational institutions as well. Okay, now in this section, Belsey talks about the ideology of liberal humanism. So what is the ideology of liberal humanism? And that's some way she connects it with common sense and how common sense becomes a sort of dominant narrative of meaning consumption and meaning making. Okay, so this is what she says, and this should be on the screen. It is in the epoch of capitalism that ideology emphasizes the value of individual freedom, freedom of conscience, and of course consumer choice in all the multiplicity of its forms. So capitalism, very paradoxically, and perhaps not so paradoxically, it generates the freedom of choice, the freedom of consumption, the freedom to consume whatever you want to do. The consumer choice becomes the most important form of freedom in capitalism, in any hyper-capitalist society. The ideology of liberal humanism assumes a world of non-contradictory and therefore fundamentally unalterable individuals whose unfettered consciousness is the origin of meaning, knowledge, and action. It is in the interests of this ideology above all to suppress the role of language in the construction of the subject and its own role in the interpellation of the subject, and to present the individual as a free, unified, autonomous subjectivity. Classic realism, still the dominant popular mode in literature, film and television drama, roughly coincides chronologically with the epoch of industrial capitalism. It performs, I wish to suggest, the work of ideology not only in its representation of a world of consistent subjects who are the origin of meaning, knowledge and action, but also in offering the reader as a position from which the text is most readily intelligible, the position of subject as the origin both of understanding and of action in accordance with that understanding. Now, this is something that is highlighted by Belsey quite clearly, that how is capitalism and classic realism, they go hand in hand, how they are so collusive with each other. What is important is to understand how this illusion of a unified subject who is autonomous, who has agency, who has free will, etc., these become very, very important in capitalism. Which is obviously an illusion. This entire illusion of the autonomy, the illusion of the autonomous subject becomes a very important illusion in capitalism and complicit with classic realism. And as I mentioned, I may have mentioned this in the previous lecture, that the rise of classic realism and the rise of capitalism are almost synchronous and sort of simultaneous with each other. Industrial capitalism, the rise of classic realism. Now, the important adjectives used over here is, when Belsey says that it's a world of non-contradictory individuals. When she says it's a world of non-contradictory individuals, which actually means that this is a consensual individuals, conformist individuals, individuals who conform to the entire ideological apparatus, the entire ideological tyranny, the entire ideological interpellation. And classic realism facilitates this consumption, facilitates this confirmation, if you will. Okay, so it performs, I wish to suggest, the work of ideology not only in this representation of the world of consistent subjects. Again, consistent subjects become very important, interpellated subjects, consistent subjects, who are the origin of meaning, knowledge and action, but also in offering the reader as a position from which the text is more readily intelligible, the position of subjects. So not only does it create consistent objects in the form of characters, classic realism, it also creates consistent subjects and readers. So readers who read the classic realism text in a particular way, they become complicit and consensual in that sense. So understanding becomes dominated and overdetermined by common sense, interpretation becomes overdetermined by common sense. So this entire idea of overdetermination becomes very, very important, and overdetermination and interpolation, they go hand in hand, especially in the way Althusser studies ideology and the apparatus controlling wielding ideology. Okay, now with that in mind, what Belsey would go on to argue, and this should be on the screen, is that classic realism is characterized by illusionism, right? So what is the illusion in classic realism? So there are certain illusions which classic realism facilitates and foregrounds. What is illusionism? Narrative which leads to closure, and a hierarchy of voices which establishes the truth of the story. Okay, so there are three conditions that classic realism draws on quite heavily. And what are the conditions? First of all, illusion. There's an illusion of completion of meaning, an illusion of totality of meaning. So there's a once upon a time and lived happily ever after structure. So there's a closure, a definite degree of closure, a narrative which leads to closure, which is designed for closures, etc., and a hierarchy of voices. So there's a hierarchy of voices. Some voices more dominant than the others over here. And what's the purpose of the hierarchy? Which establishes the truth of the story. Okay, so the veracity of the story, the truth of the story, the truth quality of the story is dependent on the hierarchy of voices in operation over here. So classic realist narrative is Rollabarth demonstrates in S/Z, turns on the creation of enigma to the precipitation of disorder, which throws into disarray the conventional cultural and signifying systems. Among the commonest sources of disorder at the level of plot in classic realism are murder, war, a journey of love. But the story moves inevitably towards closure, which is also disclosure. The dissolution of enigma through re-establishment of order, recognizable as a reinstatement of a development of the order which is understood as to have preceded the events of the story itself. So, oftentimes in classic realism, we have an accident, a murder, an interruption, and then we have a series of plot, and subplots which move towards closure. Now, the closure is also disclosure, as Belsey points out quite clearly. Why disclosure? Because it reveals the truth. It gives a very clinical understanding of truth. So the classic realist story would be the detective story, and that's a point, that's a section that Belsey would move on quite quickly from here when she takes up Sherlock Holmes. But the point she's trying to establish here quite compellingly is that classic realism, it gives you a series of accidents, a series of disruptions, only to have it all leveled out in the end through closures and disclosures, which become equally important, and for the purpose of the plot. Okay, the moment of closure is the point in which the events in the story become fully intelligible to the reader. So intelligibility, clarity, transparency, lucidity, all these things which I'm talking about since the last couple of lectures when we are looking at this text, these become very, very important for classic realism. So it should be lucid, it should be understandable in a very transparent kind of a way. So the narrative transmission should be very, very transparent in quality. So the most obvious instance is the detective story, which in the final pages, where in the final pages the murderer is revealed and the motive made plain. So everything has an explanation in the end. So the detective story becomes really the most celebratory example of classic realism, if you will, because everything is revealed in the end. The better the detective story, the more revelation comes in the end. Every explanation is offered, every riddle, every conundrum is solved, etc. So the motive is made plain, the murderer is revealed, etc. But a high degree of intelligibility is sustained through the narrative as a result of the hierarchy of voices in the text. The hierarchy works above all by means of a privileged voice which places as subordinate all the utterances that are literally or figuratively between inverted commas. So the hierarchy of voices becomes a very important example in classic realism. Now, when you take this mode, when you take this structure into a detective story and see how it works, you find the obvious hierarchy in detective stories. The detective has the topmost position in terms of the voice. The detective seems to know best what's happening in terms of the before, now, and after. The detective offers explanation, temporal explanations, semantic explanations to the readers in terms of how the action is unfolded, etc. So in that sense, the detective story becomes a classic realist text. Okay, Now with that, we come to Belsey's very, very famous reading of Sherlock Holmes. And Sherlock Holmes becomes for Belsey the very important example of classic realism, and how the entire idea of the intelligent detective, the intelligent investigator, who can offer any explanation, who can supply any kind of solution to any problem, becomes a massive example of the celebration of classic realism. But also, and equally importantly, how Belsey seems to detect the fragility in classic realism in Sherlock Holmes stories. So Sherlock Holmes stories are not just a celebration of classic realism, are not just a massive advancement of classic realism in terms of disclosure and closure and detection and investigation, but also if you do a deeper deconstruction of Sherlock Holmes narratives, as Belsey does from this section, we will manage to detect, ironically, some of the fragility, some of the uncertainty and unreliability that is inherently embedded in classic realism, which it does its best to efface, to conceal. Okay, so and there are several examples that Belsey offers in terms of Sherlock Holmes stories, and this is the story, The Return of Sherlock Holmes, and the particular story that Belsey takes up as an example is the Charles Augustus Milverton story, which is actually about a blackmail. And interestingly, if you look at the way classic realism works in these stories of Holmes, it's very male. The investigation is very male. It's very masculine, and women are often almost not given any voice. They are omissions, very, very conspicuous omissions in the narrative politics and narrative strategy, the narrative framework. So the hierarchy is very male. The male detective is literally always saying everything. So Holmes sometimes takes up a godlike position in Doyle's narratives. And so the gender and the realism, they go hand in hand in Sherlock Holmes stories, and that's something that Belsey highlights quite clearly throughout her reading of Sherlock Holmes. So how would you define, how would you characterize the Sherlock Holmes narrative, especially in relation to the scientific investigative intelligence of Holmes, especially the way it is narrated in a classic realist way? So the stories are a plea for science, not only in the sphere of conventionally associated with detection, footprints, traces of hair or cloth, cigarette ends, etc. They reflect the widespread optimism characteristic of the period concerning the comprehensive power of positivist science. So positivist science is empirical science, science which operates through detection of sight, smells, touch, etc. So everything that is positivist or palpably present or empirically evident, that becomes a part of positivist science. And so, in that sense, these stories become, they reflect the optimism characteristic of the period. So, the classic realism, the story, the celebration of intelligence in a story, they all are reflective complexly of the optimism of the male intelligence in these stories. Holmes's ability to deduce Watson's train of thought, for instance, is repeatedly displayed, and it owes nothing to the supernatural. So again, this very deliberate avoidance of supernatural in Sherlock Holmes stories becomes, the strategy becomes part of the classic realist narrative. So everything is logically explained, everything can be explained, everything is potentially explicable. And its explicability is sometimes, it becomes a highlight in Sherlock Holmes stories. It can be explained through a logical deduction, through a logical analysis, and hence it's not supernatural by default. So this lack of the supernatural, lack of the uncanny becomes a very important feature in Sherlock Holmes stories, and this is something that is very much a part of the classic realist strategy of narration. Okay, so the project of the stories themselves, enigma followed by disclosure, echoes precisely the structure of the classic realist text. So in a way, the Sherlock Holmes stories becomes a structural replication of the classic realist text, in the sense that there's an enigma, there's an accident, there is an act of violence, maybe an interruption, and it is followed by a disclosure which operates through deduction, and that becomes a classic narration of the classic realist text. That's the structure followed by classic realism or classic realist text quite extensively. And as you can see on the screen on page 93, where Belsey says quite clearly that a project also requires the maximum degree of realism, verisimilitude, plausibility. So realism, verisimilitude, plausibility, this can't possibly happen. So the plausibility factor is quite high in Sherlock Holmes, and that's a requirement, as a condition for any classic realist text in order to make it realistic in quality. In the interest of science, no hint of the fantastic or the implausible is permitted to remain once the disclosure is complete. So everything is very scientifically and logically and empirically, explicable, and so there's nothing outside the radar, outside the parameters, outside the purview of positivist science. This is why even their own existence as writing is so frequently discussed within the text. The stories are alluded to as Watson's little sketches, his memoirs. So, Watson becomes a little sketch maker, if you will, of the Sherlock Holmes stories. And a very interesting section, and this is quoted by Belsey, and should be on the screen, where the story is called The Abbey Grange, where Holmes is actually accusing Watson of not being scientific enough in terms of his narrative politics. And this is what he says. I must admit, Watson, that you have some power of selection which atones for much which I deplore in your narratives. Your fatal habit of looking at everything from the point of view of a story instead of a scientific exercise has ruined what might have been an instructive and even classical series of demonstrations. So Watson is admonished over here for not being scientifically minded enough, so being more of a storyteller rather than a scientist, and that's something which Holmes doesn't approve of, doesn't seem to approve of over here. And he is telling off Watson quite clearly by saying that, your selective powers as a narrator is quite, it leaves a lot to be desired, because you end up being a storyteller rather than a scientific analyst, and that does a disservice, according to Holmes, does a great disservice to my ability to scientifically go through evidences and proofs and make logical deductions in that process. So again, we have the voice of a very male scientist, admonishing a storyteller. So again, you could do a very interesting gender study here as well. And remember that this is the high point of imperialism. Sherlock Holmes stories have been written where the empire becomes a very important commodity, and so it becomes almost imperative for the Holmes narrator to play up the classic realist tradition, because in terms of looking at how everything can be scientifically controlled, contained, and conveyed, anything outside the realm of science becomes an absence in Sherlock Holmes. So, and there's a reference on page 95, how the Sherlock Holmes story has become a big advertisement for classic realism. But what is also interesting is, and this is what Belsey says very, very quickly, that you can see the strains, you can see the effort, and the effort given in terms of making it more and more classic realist. It then reveals the fractures, it then reveals the seams, it then reveals the constructed quality of classic realism. In that sense, it becomes a very important narrative, taken together, the Sherlock Holmes stories. So on the one hand, they are pleased for verisimilitude, they are pleased for realism, they're pleased for empiricist or empirical kind of narratives. But on the other hand, they are so anxious to repeat the entire structure over and over again that in the anxiety you might find they actually reveal their own constructed quality, they reveal their own strains. The strains begin to show. So the classic realist text had not yet developed a way of signifying woman's sexuality except in a metaphoric and symbolic mode whose presence disrupts the realist surface. Joyce and Lawrence were beginning to experiment at this time, this is the beginning of the 20th century, with modes of sexual signification, but in order to do so, they largely abandoned the codes of realism. So much is readily apparent. What is more significant, however, is that the presentation of so many women in the Sherlock Holmes stories as shadowy, mysterious, and magical figures precisely contradicts the projects of explicitness, transgresses the values of the text, and in doing so throws into relief the poverty of the contemporary concept of science. So the idea of the woman figures being shadowy, mysterious, almost magical presence in Sherlock Holmes stories, it completely undercuts the confidence of realism. It completely undercuts the confidence of positivist science. So in that sense, it begins to be problematic. Okay, these stories please for a total explicitness about the world. So these stories may be read as pleas for an entire explicitness about the world. Everything is explicit, everything can be explained, everything has an evidence. So that becomes the motto, the mantra, if you will, in the stories. But despite being pleased for total explicitness about the world, these stories are unable to explain an area where nonetheless they cannot ignore. The version of science which the texts present would constitute a clear challenge to ideology, the interpretation of all areas of life, physical, social, and psychological. is to be subject to rational scrutiny and the requirements of coherent theorization. Confronted, however, by an area in which ideology itself is uncertain, the Sherlock Holmes stories display the limits of their own project and are compelled to manifest the inadequacy of a bourgeois scientificity, which, working within the constraints of ideology, is thus unable to challenge it. So this is a very, very loaded section and an excellent example of deconstructing a certain text. So on the one hand, it's quite clear to any normal reader that Sherlock Holmes stories become a plea for empiricist science, a plea for explanation, deduction, investigation, logical analysis, etc. However, it's also a kind of narrative which cannot seem to conceal its omissions. So the omissions in Sherlock Holmes stories, they sometimes come to the fore. The inability to talk about women, the inability to talk about anything which lies outside the gendered idea of science, the very gendered, the very masculine idea of rationality in science. So anything which lies outside it is omitted by default, and that becomes a very important condition, because then what we see here is an inability to talk about things outside the the rationalistic narrative, and in that inability it begins to sort of show its own fractures. And this is what Belsey says quite clearly, that they display the limits of their own project. So they expose the limits, the constraints of their own project. The constraints being the constraint of masculine rationality, and anything outside that particular epistemic system becomes inadmissible by default. And therein lies omission, therein lies the absences, and the absences are due to the inadmissibility. They're inadmissible because they cannot come inside the limits of the bourgeois rational masculine structure, or the bourgeois scientificity, which is constantly highlighted by Holmes. But the over-reliance on the bourgeois scientificity also exposes the omissions in Holmes, which then become a problem. And therein lies the double condition of Sherlock Holmes stories. On one hand, they become a plea, they become an advertisement for realism, an advertisement for explicit knowledge. On the other hand, they also display the limits of that knowledge. So in that sense, it becomes a very important, a very complex text. Okay, and this is the section with which we'll end. In adopting, and this is last word on classic realism that Belsey says, the classic realist text installs itself in the space between fact and illusion through the presentation of a simulated reality which is plausible but not real. In this lies its power as myth. So classic realism is a myth, but it's a very effective myth in the sense that it's a myth which relies on verisimilitude, the appearance of truth, not truth, but appearance of truth. It is because fiction does not normally deal with politics directly, except in the form of history or satire, that is ostensibly innocent and therefore ideologically effective. But in its evasion of the real who lies on a weakness as realism. The evasion of the real also lies the weakness as realism. So it find that it's actually not been able to incorporate or encompass what is really real, right? And the inability to encompass everything which is real, that becomes a problem, that becomes a limitation in classic realism, and that limitation is experienced in Sherlock Holmes stories. Through the transgression of their own values of explicitness and verisimilitude, the Sherlock Holmes stories contain within themselves an implicit critique of the limited nature as characteristic examples of classic realism. So the Sherlock Holmes stories may be read as an implicit critique of realism, in the sense that it doesn't seem to be able to acknowledge everything that is out there in the real world. So in that sense, it is a very limited form of representation, and a limited quality of representation is highlighted in Sherlock Holmes stories, especially in the way Belsey is reading it. They thus offer the reader, through the process of reading as work, a form of knowledge not about life or the world, but about the nature of fiction itself. So it is a metafictional quality about Sherlock Holmes that Belsey is sort of able to sort of get out. So by not being able to offer knowledge outside its own realistic parameter, classic realist parameter, the Sherlock Holmes stories become, they tell you not just things about the world, but also the nature of fiction itself, the fact that it's fiction. Okay, so, and the last bit that Belsey says is very, very important, and she says, in the Sherlock Holmes stories, classic realism ironically tells the truth, though not the truth about the world, which is a project of classic realism. The truth of the stories tell is the truth about ideology, the truth which ideology represses, its own existence as ideology itself. So this is a beautiful and brilliant example of reading of ideology, and what Belsey is saying away is quite moving. And she says that, ironically, the classic realism and Sherlock Holmes stories, they end up telling a truth. But it's not a truth about the world. It's a truth about its own limitation as a narrative technique. The truth is, it's a truth about its own inadequacy as a narrative technique. That's something which is highlighted in the Sherlock Holmes stories. So it's not a truth about, it's not a tall claim about knowing everything about the world. It's actually an inward-looking truth which tells you the limitations of classic realism as a narrative. And that's something which is highlighted in the Sherlock Holmes stories. And by extension, it also tells you the truth about the limitation of ideology. The ideology is actually a construct. Ideology is a discursive information, as a narrative which is formed by material and abstract conditions, but ideology is not the truth. Ideology is a partial representation of the truth. So the limitation of classic realism in Sherlock Holmes stories, which is highlighted if you do a deep reading of it, is also by extension the limitation of ideology and the claim ideology has on reality. So ideology is not reality, and that's something which we get to know if you do a deeper deconstructionist reading of Sherlock Holmes, and that's what Belsey says. The truth the stories tell is the truth about ideology, the truth which ideology represses. And what is the truth? Its own existence as ideology itself. So ideology is ideological in quality. Ideology is not outside of ideology. It is a formation, it is an act of formation, it's an act of construction which can be deconstructed. Right? So this is a very, very moving session, as you can see, and this gives a very fresh perspective on Sherlock Holmes stories, and stories which you grew up reading as adolescent readers. But you know, it's very important. Of course, it's profoundly political, as I mentioned. The stories were written at the height of the empire. So the anxieties of intelligence, anxieties of positivistic science were very historical at that point in time. So in that sense, it's a profound historical text. But Belsey does something more complex. She takes up the historical condition of Sherlock Holmes, but at the same time, she investigates the narrative conditions in Sherlock Holmes and how even the narrative conditions generate an anxiety, which may be read as anxiety of the classic realist text itself. The fact that it cannot really tell you about what's really happening in the world. It doesn't quite know outside of its own, positivistic parameter. And that's something which the Sherlock Holmes stories reveal, its own constructed quality and its own inadequacy as classic realist texts. So with that, we conclude Catherine Belsey's critical practice. I'm hoping you found this interesting. And we'll now move on to the final text of this particular course, which is Slavoj Žižek's Welcome to the Desert of the Real, which should be the text in our next session. Thank you for your attention.